Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy. So, in preparation for the much anticipated release of The Passenger later this year, I am knocking out the last few books of Cormac McCarthy's that I have not read. He is my favorite author, and I want to have his entire bibliography under my belt by the time The Passenger comes out. And now, after reading Outer Dark, the only book I have left to read of his that I haven't yet is Suttree, which I hope to get to at some point between now and the release of The Passenger. But the last book of Cormac McCarthy's that I reviewed was his debut, The Orchard Keeper. That book was surprisingly really unimpressive. It was definitely a debut. Did not wow me. It was a pretty glaring William Faulkner ripoff with some seriously purple prose in it, and some really badly, very thinly rendered characters, and ultimately it just didn't really have much of a point. That I think that actually may be his weakest book to me now. I don't really like Child of God that much because I think that one is kind of just a little exploitative. But I think that one, in my current estimation, may actually surpass The Orchard Keeper because The Orchard Keeper did not have that much to recommend it. But now, having read Outer Dark, which is his sophomore novel, I can see a lot of improvement. This is still not the master that we know. This was not yet the master who wrote Blood Meridian and The Road and such. This is still definitely a product of his formative years, but there is a lot of improvement from The Orchard Keeper. I don't think I would rank Outer Dark among his best works, but I think it is a pretty solid work, and again, much better than its predecessor. To rate Outer Dark, I would give Outer Dark a B minus. I think I would give it a B minus. It's right there on the edge, but I would give it a B minus. I think it's solid enough. So, what is Outer Dark about? Well, this is one of his Appalachian Southern Gothic works, which comprised his first few books before he switched to the Western and neo-Western genre with Blood Meridian and the Border Trilogy and whatnot. So, this book takes place in an unspecified area of Appalachia, presumably around the turn of the last century, judging by the technological level on display in the book. And it follows the exploits of Culla and Renthi Holm, a brother and sister pair who have engaged in an incestuous relationship which produced a child, which the brother, Culla, proceeded to leave in the woods to die, but got picked up by a wandering itinerant salesman type guy, and Renthi discovers this and sets out to find her baby, and the book is just comprised of the separate wanderings of this brother and sister pair as they traverse this very kind of very Southern Gothic landscape of early 1900s Appalachia. So that is the plot, such as it is. It has more of a plot than The Orchard Keeper, and that was a big mark in its favor because The Orchard Keeper was just this meandering nothing that didn't really have any kind of goal in mind. But Outer Dark does. Now, there are some problems with it, which I'm going to get into. But overall, I liked this book. I did not like it nearly as much as his later books, but I think this really did show some promise. So, this is a really grotesque book, but it's also not without some comic relief. Very black comedy, but it is actually really funny at parts. But the book is also, I think, the most explicitly biblical thing that Cormac McCarthy ever wrote. Now, McCarthy is not known for a lot of literary allusions or references in his works. He very much kind of just likes to, exclude all that else. But every now and then he does include references to prior works of literature, and the Bible is one of the most prominent things that he references, and never more so than with this. The very title of this book, Outer Dark, is a reference to the exterior darkness or outer darkness, which is referenced in the Gospel of Matthew, and which nobody can really agree on what that exactly means. But either way, this book is kind of uh, pervaded by a sense of the biblical, whether it be a direct analogy or just kind of an aura and an atmosphere. These characters wandered in two separate storylines that sort of overlap at the end, but they encounter different peoples over the course of their travels, including three very sinister strangers whose nature and intents and motives we don't really even know, but who really are the pall that hangs over this story, and it all is kind of tied together with some kind of message, I think. And that's the thing. I don't really know what this book is trying to say, but I think it was trying to say something, which is more than I can say for The Orchard Keeper, because that book I don't really think had a lot on its mind. This book I think does, but it's very oblique. It's very kind of veiled. So, as I said, it's very replete with biblical references. In particular, there's a scene towards the end of the book where the brother Culla encounters a group of swine herds and maybe or maybe not runs accidentally or intentionally these pigs off of a cliff to the ire of the swine herds. And this is a clear reference to the tale of the possessed swine in the Bible, and also serves to liken the character of Culla home to the forces of darkness, because he is kind of the, I don't want to say that he's the villain of this story, but the difference in character between he and his sister is distinct. Renthy's character in this book is not intentionally virtuous or pious, but she's not nearly as remorseless or at times just outright vile as her brother is. And so there is kind of this angel demon dichotomy at work in this book, with Culla being the demon, as it is literally directly analogized with the possessed swine story from the Bible, and Renthy being the angelic figure because she is the kind of the Madonna chasing after her lost child. So, but beyond that, there are these three mysterious strangers who come and go out of the story, who I don't really know the significance of, but they were significant. I think they were the book's real meat. They're very sinister, and the culmination of this book, what happens at the end, is one of the most grotesque things I think that Cormac McCarthy has ever written. And a lot of people probably won't like it, but I think there was some kind of purpose in mind. I think it was trying to say something, but I'm not entirely sure. I don't have enough confidence as of yet to really say what that might be. But the reason I like this book so much more than his debut, and why I view this as such a step up from The Orchard Keeper, is because there really was you really get the sense that there was a destination in mind here, this actually was building to something, and it did build to something, but a lot of people probably won't like it. The writing in this book was also much better than The Orchard Keeper, although not without flaw. Still, the Orchard Keeper had a lot of purple prose in it, and with Cormac McCarthy, you're walking a fine line because his style of writing can so often veer, can could I suppose so often veer into purple prose territory, and it does it a couple times in some of his books. There were a couple of places in The Crossing I could point out there. It was just like, stop. You made your metaphor. Just let it end. You're running on too long, and it's becoming too convoluted and circuitous and just to look at me. The Orchard Keeper was like that. This book was not like that as much, although there were still a couple of instances where I was like, "You're literally just sitting here with a thesaurus in hand, writing this in the most needlessly ridiculous fashion." But those instances were much fewer and far between than they were in his debut novel. So that again is why I view this as such a step up. But there was a couple parts where I was like, did you even think about these words when you were putting them down, or did you just put them down because they sounded cool? Um, but because I love his writing style. I think he is the best writer alive because of the way he writes. It's just that you're walking a tightrope because you got to keep it. You got to keep your eyes on the prize. You got to keep your focus on what you're trying to say. And at times it can get away from him and be a little bit more flowery than it needs to be. And it did that at a couple times in Outer Dark, but not nearly as much as in the predecessor. So it's mostly solid. But overall, this is probably the most not only biblical, but this is perhaps one of the most mystical things that he's ever written. And that was my main complaint. One of my main complaints with The Orchard Keeper was that it was so apparently just a Faulkner clone. It didn't really have an identity of its own. This book really does, because this book demonstrates the shift towards away from the literal and more towards the mystical that McCarthy would later come to be renowned for. Because even though, and that's the cool thing about his books, even though they work on two different levels. They tell a story that can be read literally as like nothing really too extraordinary happens, like with Blood Meridian, but yet there's always that undercurrent, that thin vein of the mystical, of the potentially supernatural that undercuts the entire thing. And this book, I think, shows where he really first stepped into that, and as a result, set himself apart from William Faulkner, who I take it was his greatest influence at the time. Because this book is both literal and figurative at the same time, and I really like that. And that is partly why I keep coming back to Cormac McCarthy, and partly why he is my favorite author, because he is so able to he's able to do that so well, usually. I don't really know what the exact meaning or message of this book was, but I think there was something. I think there was something here. There is a conversation towards the end of the book that Culla Holm has with these three mysterious guys who are incredibly sinister. And by the way, that's one thing that Cormac McCarthy can do better than any other author, is write something sinister. Like the conversations with Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men, and some of the conversations with the judge in Blood Meridian, there is a palpable sense of, oh shit, this could go pear shaped like that. Somebody's finna die. There's that palpable dread that overhangs some of the interactions between the characters in his books, and it's on great display in this scene towards the end of the book where Culla Holm is conversing with these three somebodies, and there's a they talk about the importance of names, and how if something doesn't have a name, then you cannot lay claim to that something. It's I don't know exactly what it was trying to say, because I don't think he hadn't really got to the part where he was necessarily, I think, tying everything together as tightly as he would do in later books. But there's this conversation about, because this baby that Culla leaves out in the woods to die is never named, because and you don't bother naming a kid that you're just going to abandon in the woods. And so this guy is telling him, this incredibly sinister and just almost demonic guy is telling him that things without a name cannot be claimed, in that I don't know, it's really leaning hard into that mysticism that is so prevalent in later books, and I'm really glad to see that, because this was, I think, where he really came into his own. It's not perfect, like I said. It's still, I would rank it lowly in his body of work, but this one, I think, is where he really came into his own and started to do his own thing in a more demonstrable fashion. So yeah, Outer Dark. It's really grotesque. It's really dark, but again, there is some serious comedy to it, and that's the thing, is that it manages to be both horrifying and kind of comical at the same time, but it does it a lot better than Child of God did. Because Child of God was his third book. I think that one was kind of a step back after this one, because that book has a lot of black comedy in it too, but I don't think it landed nearly as well. There's the part where he runs the pigs off the cliff, and the swine herders are debating on how they're going to, enact their retribution against him. That was hilarious. It was truly, that had me smiling to myself reading that whole scene, because of how well the comedy was integrated into it. Even though it's simultaneously horrifying and depraved, it was still so funny. And so I think a lot of people will just read this as just this bleak, grotesque tale of depravity and debauchery, and I don't really think it is. I mean, it is that, but it's also got some serious humor to it, if you're looking for it, if you're willing to pick up on it. So I think it's a really well-rounded work. The writing was much stronger than the previous book, but not nearly to the standards as it would be in his later books, and it was a little showboaty at times, but not, again, as nearly as bad as with The Orchard Keeper. But this book felt like it had a purpose. It felt like it was going somewhere, and it was interesting all the way through. Although I think the latter half of it was much more engaging than the first half of it. But overall, I like this book. I'm not going to say I loved it. I mean, he obviously has written better, but I think this right here, I think Outer Dark is the one where he really came into his own, and took off. This shows this shows the germs of what would come later. This shows the seeds of what would later blossom into the master that we all know. And so I think it's worth a read, if only to see where he really got cooking. So yeah. Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy. Have you read Outer Dark? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I've said here today. If you have not read Outer Dark, and if you are as big a fan of McCarthy as I am, then you probably should definitely give it a read. Or if you just want to read some seriously dark but also twistedly funny Southern Gothic mystical kind of book that won't take you very long. It only took me 2 days to read this. It's a pretty short book. If you want to read something like that, I'd say go for it. I think this book will more than suffice. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to like, subscribe, help the channel out a little bit. I would greatly appreciate it. And until next time, peace.